Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm Matt Levitt, Director of the Reinhard Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence and the Fromer-Wexler Senior Fellow here. And I am really thrilled and pleased and honored to be sitting here with my colleague, Dr. Devorah Margolin, and to have with us virtually Dr. Austin Doctor and Martyn Warr. Austin is the Director of the Counterterrorism Research Initiatives at the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, that's InSight, and an assistant professor of political science at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Devorah is the Blumenstein Rosenblum Fellow here at the Washington Institute in the Counterterrorism Program and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Her research focuses primarily on terrorism governance, propaganda and strategic communications, and the role of women in gender and violent extremism. Together, the two of them are among the authors of this fabulous study, Reintegration of Foreign Terrorist Fighter Families, a Framework of Best Practices for the United States, which was published by InSight. And we're thrilled to have with us Martyn Warr, a career diplomat in Britain's Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office, where he heads the Counter-Daesh Communications Cell. He's a specialist in counterterrorism and other security-related matters. He's been posted to Saudi Arabia, to Portugal, to Spain, and other various Gulf states, and most recently in northern Iraq and Kurdistan as the Consul General. And I'm thrilled to have you all here today for a conversation about what to do with the families of Islamic State foreign fighters. We have the opportunity today to hear from our experts and then engage them in conversation. For those of you who are joining us via the Zoom, you'll be able to ask questions via the Q&A button in the bottom middle of your screen. Those of you who are watching the event on the live stream will be able to ask questions by sending us your question via email at the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. That's policyforum, one word, at washingtoninstitute, one word, .org. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to the three of you. Let's start with Martyn and then go to Austin and end with Devorah, and then we'll go to our Q&A. Thank you all in advance for taking the time to do this. Martyn, the floor is yours.
Matt, thank you very much indeed. And hello to everybody from King Charles Street in London. First, another thank you to the Washington Institute for this opportunity to contribute to what is really a very important debate about the repatriation of families associated with Daesh. I'm going to give a brief description of the coalition's position and work on repatriation. And I am, of course, then very happy to join Austin and Dev to answer the difficult questions that will come our way. Can I start by explaining who I am and who I'm not, so there's no confusion about the status of what I'm about to say. As Matt has just said, I'm the head of the Counter-Daesh Communications Cell based here in London in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. The UK is a co-lead of the Coalition's Communications Working Group, and we have a dedicated team of specialists here conducting all of the Coalition's civilian communications. We also work very closely with our military colleagues to ensure that we're in sync. We run communications campaigns to counter Daesh's propaganda, to support local communities vulnerable to that propaganda, and to maintain the cohesion and the momentum of the coalition, a coalition of the voluntary. So it's very important that we actively, consciously maintain that body. Our main work remains in Iraq and Syria, but we are also expanding into West Africa and Afghanistan, given that I'm afraid Daesh has done just that. We act as the voice of the coalition at key moments, such as the loss of a Daesh leader, of which there seems to have been quite a few quite recently, I'm pleased to say, but also sadly when a terrorist attack takes place. So we are the mouthpiece at that point. But the coalition as such does not have a spokesperson, and I'm not speaking in that capacity today, just to emphasize what I'm not as well as what I am. I'll be describing what the coalition is doing more than offering an official position for public consumption. I hope everybody can spot the distinction there. I hope that's fine. So the first thing I want to say is that the coalition thinks resolving the position of and the circumstances of the thousands, tens of thousands of women and children associated with Daesh who are in the camps in northeast Syria is an absolute priority. Daesh is down, but it is not out in Syria and Iraq. It does not hold territory in either country, but it does hold sway. It does influence. And it's that sway or influence that matters when we talk of the women and children in the camps. The humanitarian circumstances of those residents and the camps, especially al-Hawl, are poor. There are all sorts of ways to describe it. I was there quite recently. They are really very poor. Camps are not built for the 50,000 plus people who are there at the moment, and they've not been upgraded to cope with that number. I think it's fair to say the situation of the children in those camps is especially worrying. They get no education of the sort that we would understand. Indeed, their principal educators, I'm afraid to say, are probably Daesh. Security of the camps for the residents themselves and the communities close by is pretty inadequate. It's getting better, but it's still not good enough. We know that Daesh operates in the camps, including in al-Roj, in its usual murderous, abusive, and intimidating way. I had some first-hand evidence of that while I was there quite recently. And we know that it uses the camps as a tool to radicalize and recruit as sustained support from its supporters. So we, like all, are especially worried about the potentially radicalizing effect of all of this on the children in the camps. In short, we feel that if the threat from Daesh is to be contained long-term, not just militarily, but psychologically, the circumstances of those in the camps need to be addressed. So the coalition thinks it's crucial that the humanitarian security reasons, for humanitarian and security reasons, that the size of these camps be reduced as much as possible and as quickly as possible. Realistically, they're not going to be, they're not going to disappear. There will always be a core, probably of 10 to 15,000 who will not be able to be repatriated or managed in some fashion. But the more we can get down to that sort of figure through repatriation, perhaps above all, the better. That's why the coalition under UK and US leadership brought as many of the key actors together as possible for the first time to discuss exactly how we would do this at a special meeting in Amman late last year. Military, political, humanitarian, government, and non-governmental representatives pulled together to meet to talk it all through. I stress, for the first time, most people imagine that this sort of thing is happening all the time. The reality of the situation is that it is not, and there are all sorts of understandable reasons for that, but that circumstance does need to change. Since then, there's been a notable greater focus on the question of repatriation and some success. Don't want to over-exaggerate that or even just exaggerate it, but we do think there are cautious reasons for a little bit of optimism. I'm pleased to be able to say that the population of al-Hawl this week is likely to dip below 50,000 for the first time since the fall of Baghouth in 2019, when tens of thousands of members of the families and their children were taken to al-Hawl. That's because there should be a notable shipment, as it were, of Iraqis and also movement of Syrians out of the camp. Since the beginning of 2002, 4,200 Iraqis have been repatriated from the camps, and that does not include, I think, an additional 500 to 600 who will be moving over the next few days. The government of Iraq has set up a system which repatriates 150 families every month, or it should. and for similar numbers to be returned to their communities out of Jeddah 1 to settle permanently. I say it should because that figure has not been met every month, but it's doing quite well against that target, and there is a target for us all to aim for. On the whole, the system is working. It's got its faults, but people are moving out of the circumstances of al-Hawl to better circumstances. On the ground, it's the coalition, amongst others, that are moving these people. With the UN and the NGOs, nobody else is in the position to do that. And I think it's also fair to say that through constant political engagement by the coalition and its member states with the government of Iraq, that momentum is building. Situation for Syrians, I'm afraid, has been less encouraging. Syria is a complicated place, and the circumstances of those concerned is considerably more complicated than those than Iraqis. We understand that about 1,400 Syrians have been reintegrated as opposed to repatriated, reintegrated back into their communities since the beginning of 2022. But that is a considerably more difficult task to achieve. We do think, though, that the pause on reintegration of Syrians is about to end with actually 219 Syrians having left al-Hawl camp only a few days ago on Monday this week to return to Manbij. Lots of pushing and shoving by the coalition and its members, and we will keep on pushing and shoving so that more Syrians can return to their communities. On third country nationals, over 800, nearly 1,000 have been repatriated since the start of 2022, with a notable uptick in the numbers this year, 2023. And it has to be said that the US has been an especially strong advocate and facilitator of those repatriations. So the coalition as a whole and as individual members is also responsible for better security in the camps. We don't formally run the camps. That is the responsibility of the SDF and the SAIJ. But we are instrumental in improving the security infrastructure as well as the WASH educational and sports facilities there. And I saw some of those on my recent trip. Also, for the better coordination between the Iraqi authorities and the Syrian authorities on repatriation. That is no easy process to get those two sides to come together and actually deliver tangible returns. But the coalition has stepped in and is hosting a lot of that coordination. Looking forward, it's absolutely clear that this focus by the coalition of camps will continue. The subject of the camps and the repatriation will be a key talking point at the coalition's annual ministerial in Riyadh next week. Gaps for filling, things to do, of which there are a lot, in the camps conditions and the movements of Iraqis and Syrians, who are the majority of the camp population, are being identified in a way that has not happened before. More funds will be sought and, I think, crucially pledged, specifically for the camps, returning residents, and the communities into which they return, because bolstering the capacities of those communities is really fundamental if they are to be absorbed and to settle in a durable fashion. It is just worth remembering that most of the funds, and we're talking many billions of pounds and dollars, provided by the international community for the rebuilding of Iraq and Syria, still a lot to do, have been provided by members of the coalition, even if it's not the coalition itself that has delivered those projects. But it is definitely one of the responsibilities of the coalition to garner support for more funds and those that has already been delivered. On communication, so this is my last point, we believe that communications can improve the security and humanitarian circumstances in the camps and increase the flow of Syrians and Iraqis being returned to their communities and accepted by their communities. We try and put ourselves in the shoes of those residents and those communities to imagine what it is like. Communications gaps, which is more filled by Daesh than anybody else. And we feel that our job, along with those who are on the ground in practice, moving people and supporting people, preparing people, we do feel it a responsibility on the part of the coalition to support that effort. The more ideas that people have on how that can be done, and the more resources that can come with those ideas, the better. We know that in those communities, the recipient communities, acceptance is a particular problem, along with the security or lack of security in some cases that await returnees, jobs, need for, lack of, and access to services. We're very conscious that these communities are overloaded at the moment, so more people moving back into them is not always a very welcome thought. So we're working on all of those fronts in a communicative sense. We're working in the camps to prepare its residents to leave. We're working with the UN organizations in Syria and Iraq and with the government of Iraq to reduce the stigmatism attached to al-Hawl residents as they return to their communities. With UNDP, we're already being able to show how communications can overcome hostility to former al-Hawl residents and help them settle. And to improve the reputation of the camps. This is a crucial point. Reputation of the camps and the residents further. We're about to launch a new set of materials on our coalition communications channels to show a more positive picture of both, to help displace the notion that Daesh perpetuates of a very negative narrative around these circumstances. We also plan to use that positive picture to encourage more donors to get behind success, as we're describing it, and to provide more concrete support for recipient communities so that they can accept more returnees and be more comfortable about that. And finally, we're using communications to amplify the increasing number of convictions of Daesh returnees to deter those who might still support Daesh or who are tempted to support Daesh. The campaign also helps to show Daesh's victims that they have not been forgotten. The abuse they have suffered will not be overlooked, and that Daesh will be brought to justice, which is the hashtag for our campaigns. I hope that's a useful snapshot of the coalition's work on repatriation. It's a mammoth task. Nothing I've said is meant to suggest otherwise. We need more, frankly, of everything. More support in the camps, more support along the way. We use the phrase al-Hawl to home. More support in the communities, more repatriations. It's moving in the right direction, but we need it to accelerate. Look forward to Austin and Dev's presentations and to subsequent questions. Thank you, Matt.
Super. So some reason for optimism, but lots to do. Austin?
Hey, thanks, Matt. First, I'll say it's a pleasure to join this fantastic group for today's panel. Matt, thanks so much to you, to Dev, and the Washington Institute for hosting this important discussion. As you mentioned during my introduction, I'm Austin Doctor. I serve as the Director of Counterterrorism Research Initiatives at Insight. That's the DHS Center of Excellence for Counterterrorism and Terrorism Prevention Research. We are proudly based at the University of Nebraska at Omaha and lead a global consortium of more than 60 researchers from across 26 universities and non-government organizations. I'm a political scientist by training. I've been working on the foreign fighter problem set for over a decade now, and I think relevant to our discussion today with a pointed focus on the Islamic State and its global operations. As part of that work, it's been a pleasure to lead a team alongside Dev in a 2-year project funded by DHS Science and Technology Directorate. Our task as a team has been to address the critical question that we're here to discuss today. What do we do about ISIS foreign fighter families that are still detained in northeastern Syria? And how do we repatriate and reintegrate them in a way that's based and rooted and grounded in identified best practice? This work has taken our research team to Iraq, to Europe, to different parts of the United States. I'm excited to share just a few of those insights from our project and related report today. In these brief initial comments, I want to outline some of the goals and processes I think can facilitate what I'll say is the sustainable, durable, and holistic reintegration for foreign terrorist fighter families, and emphasize why a systematic framework for best practices or of best practices is needed in this effort. Martyn, you provided, I think, a really brilliant and insightful view into the status of global repatriation efforts. I'm not going to attempt to add to that in any way other than just to reiterate, right, that the United States and its partners, including the UK, have come to make repatriation a policy priority, and that within the United States, there's general domestic partisan consensus that the repatriation of foreign terrorist fighter families from northeastern Syria should be done expediently. And I think there's, as you said, Martyn, room for cautious optimism here. We're starting to see that begin to happen at scale and across the global partnership of coalition member states. That said, there's clearly a lot of work that still remains to be done. If we're pivoting this now to focus on the US case, the number of US persons that have already been repatriated represents a relatively small percentage of the total number of foreign persons that are still held in detention. I think formally speaking, 39 people have been brought back to the United States to date, 15 adults, 24 minors. It's likely that there are more US persons that remain in detention, but that actual number, that total number remains unclear. At this point, the core question, the question that remains is, how do we get this right? When we're talking about that transition then from repatriation to reintegration, how do we avoid some of those common pitfalls of ad hoc policy implementation and ensure that the reintegration process in the United States is informed by evidence best practice? And so 2 quick takeaways here. First, effective reintegration programming requires a shared and clear understanding of what success means and how it would be evaluated. It's difficult, if not impossible, to implement best practices without that universal set of goals in place. Second is that much of the success of reintegration policy and practice is going to rely on organizational structures and processes established behind it, having clearly specified roles and responsibilities. And so the question then is, okay, what does this look like? At the top level, reintegration is not just one thing, it's a collection of coordinated processes, the goal of which, the idea of success, is that returnees would feel a sense of inclusiveness and belonging in their community, and that we would see a significantly reduced risk of their engagement or recidivism into violent extremism. The other thing I want to underscore here is that reintegration is not just about returnees themselves. I think Martyn alluded to this in his preliminary comments. It's in that reintegration is also fundamentally about the relationship between returnees and their new home communities. And so with that in mind, with so many players involved, there are a number of challenges to getting this right, where and evidence best practices can help to overcome these and create more durable, sustainable programs and case outcomes. Some of those challenges, without getting too far into the weeds, gender and age-related biases, stigmatization, sensitive local politics, policy cascades with overlapping domestic homeland security priorities, the synchronization of parallel case management for, say, offending parents and their minor children. And lastly, facilitating coordinated action across a diverse and likely geographically dispersed mission community. And so to mitigate programmatic risks related to some of these challenges, I think it's best to adopt what I call an aim small, miss small approach, where if we see community inclusiveness and minimize risk as the end goal, a couple of more pointed objectives and processes can help to guide and facilitate those ultimate outcomes. For example, I think it's important that policies built around reintegration, that they be aligned with the scale of a country's specific returnee profile. This is not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution blueprint. Second, returnee case management plans should be tailored as in so far as possible to each individual, but ultimately guided by or rooted in common strategic principles, things like sensitivity to stigmatization, a focus on the family as a collective unit, and ensuring access to trauma-informed care. And lastly, I think it's important to note that this will require close coordination between practitioners and multi-sector partners at the federal, state, local, and tribal levels. The hands and feet of this work are going to be done locally, but from a processy standpoint, it's going to be essential that national, regional level teams provide coordination, management, and resource support. In other words, this will require full interagency engagement. Looking at the clock, I'll just wrap it up by saying that the work of repatriation and reintegration remains both urgent and important. We can credibly minimize some of the related programmatic risks by adopting an evidence-based approach. At this point, let me turn things back over to my colleagues. I'm eager to hear Dev's initial comments and to move into our discussion and Q&A. Thanks, Matt. Back over to you.
Super awesome. Thank you very much. Dev, take us home. Solve it all.
Solve it all. No problem. First and foremost, thank you to Martyn, Austin, for offering your vital insights into the work of the Anti-Daesh Coalition, as well as the framework and the need for a framework of best practices. So I hope to use my time to build on these comments and highlight key principles that drive our understanding of these issues, as well as any framework that we need to build. And that is first and foremost a nuanced understanding of age and gender-based biases and their effects on how we create policies for Islamic State affiliated families. These biases shape our understanding of detention, repatriation, accountability, and reintegration. And in the 4 years since the collapse of the Islamic State's territorial control in March 2019 in Baghouz, the international community has seen many successes in the fight against ISIS, most of these focusing on the insurgency that still operates. But we still struggle to find a consensus on repatriation, accountability, and reintegration. Recently, the UN reiterated for the numerous time that the indefinite detention of ISIS-affiliated individuals, some who've been held for over 4 years, raises a number of humanitarian and security concerns. And a reminder to our audience, just the scope of this issue that we're talking about. Detention camps, there's more than one. There's many camps and prisons that are holding these individuals, including individuals from third country nationals, as we call them, TCNs, Syrians, and Iraqis. Prisons hold thousands of men, including 2,000 men and boys, in prisons from over 60 different countries, such as Gwern prison, where the home or the site of the January 2022 attacks, or Raqqa Detention Center, which was recently hurt in the recent earthquakes. There are also now rehabilitation centers holding teenage boys that have been moved out of detention camps. And these detention camps, such as Roj Camp, which holds 2,500 individuals, including 2,000 third country nationals, or al-Hawl Camp, which, as Martyn noted, for the first time dipped below 50,000 individuals. 90% of the individuals in al-Hawl are women and children. 23% of all residents are under the age of 5. And as mentioned by my colleagues, I'll again reiterate it, since 2019, we've seen approximately 2,700 individuals from third country nationals repatriated, and about 1,200 families or 5,000 Iraqis returned to Iraq. We've now started to see movement among Syrian nationals as well, and this is a step in the right direction. In 2023 alone, we've seen 12 countries repatriate individuals. Recently, Ian Moss, deputy of the Counterterrorism Bureau at State, made a statement here at the Washington Institute in which he said he believes 25 countries will repatriate this year. So hopefully we hit that stat. But that still means that we have 10,000 third country nationals that still remain in northeast Syria, not counting more than 25,000 Iraqis and 18,000 Syrians. The repatriation process has been slow, and it's vital to acknowledge that the majority of those who remain are women and minors, highlighting the need, again, to take a gender and age-based approach. As we talk about repatriation, we also need to talk about the importance of accountability and reintegration in this process. These discussions need to be centered on our entrenched knowledge gaps and challenges, as mentioned by my colleague Austin, and many of these center on our own biases related to age and gender, such as who receives weapons training, Who was exposed to violence? When were girls expected to marry and become mothers? As well as what were women's roles under the Islamic State? Building off of our research and our field work, we came up with several best practices focusing on 3 key areas. That would basically create a strategic and proactive approach to repatriation. And again, each of these centers on our age and gender-based biases. So first, highlighting the work of Martyn and the Anti-Daesh Coalition's Strategic Communication Cell, we need a clear and strategic communication strategy that garners civil support. We have to have an overarching method that manages expectations, is well developed, focuses on the fact that language matters. I always like to think about the fact that we call them foreign terrorist fighter families. Not everyone who joined the Islamic State was a fighter. It's a very gendered term, an idea that only men are fighters or only men are part of the Islamic State. So even how we call these individuals affects the policy we create. And we need to make sure that we integrate evaluation tools into our mechanisms. Second, for repatriation, accountability, and reintegration programs to be successful, as Austin mentioned, for people to be highly functioning members of society, we need to have a trauma-informed care approach for these families. That means equipping case managers and providers with expertise and resources, a tailor-made and sustainable system. Trauma-related symptoms need to be addressed. We need to match people with appropriate settings. And finally, again, we need to evaluate early and often. And once again, my third point, evaluations are needed. We need to leverage the instruments we already have. We need to ensure a simplicity and tailor-made to the risks and individuals that are there, right? Minors and women are the majority of these individuals. So perhaps some of the mechanisms that we already have in place are not the right tools, and we need to adapt them for the population that we're dealing with. I'll end by highlighting some of the, what I like to call the known unknowns, the things that make the precarious situation that we are dealing with even more precarious and important to address in a timely manner. That includes the ISIS threat on detention camps, both internal and external, the threat of natural disasters, such as the recent earthquake in Syria and Syria and Turkey, as well as the possible Turkish intervention. What does that mean if Turkey decides to do an incursion into northeast Syria, and what does that mean for the future as the SDF? And finally, the most recent Syrian normalization. What will that mean for northeast Syria? With all these issues at play, we need to move forward with these discussions in a timely manner. And so I will hand it back to Matt to facilitate some question and answer. Thank you.
Fantastic. 3 fabulous presentations. Our only problem here is that I've got about, an hour and a half of questions of my own, which we're not going to do because I want to get to all the questions that have come in. I want to remind you're able to submit questions if you're on the Zoom function directly through the Q&A function in the bottom middle of your screen. If you're watching on the live stream, feel free, please, to submit a question via email to the address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. So I'd like to start with a couple of broad questions that each of the 3 of you can take a shot at answering, but maybe we can try and answer them briefly so that we can get on. And then I'll move to a question for each of you, and I'd ask that others only jump in on that if they really have a very strong held 2-finger, so that we can get to the questions, a bunch of which have already come in. So one of the big themes that I heard really from all 3 of you is the need to counter stigmatization and reintegrate people into communities, but also the need to have accountability and for there to be prosecutions. Hashtag ISIS will be brought to justice. How do we go about reconciling those 2 things? Does it not make it more difficult to convince people to go home if it's made clear to them they're going to face stiff sentences, maybe be separated from their children? Does it not stress to people back home that the individuals that we're seeking to repatriate are people who went and, bottom line, joined, whether they fought or did other things, were part of a really nasty terrorist organization that could pose some risk? How do we try and balance these 2 pretty competing issues of reintegration, addressing the stigma, but at the same time, feeling the need to hold people accountable and prosecute people, which will also contribute to stigmatization? Mm-hmm. So maybe we'll take this in reverse order. Dev?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think about it almost as a dual communication strategy. I think it's important to communicate to your citizens in your country that you are going to be repatriating to, your civil society, that accountability is a huge part of this. And I use the word accountability and not prosecution, because I think for each country, there are a different set of laws in place, and there are a different set of tools that can be used to hold people accountable. And for each country, that is going to be a very different process, depending on the number of travelers they had, the crimes that were involved, how society is built, and how they can hold individuals accountable. But I think accountability is a vital part of that process for ensuring that those who are accepting individuals know that those returning are going to be held accountable for the decision to go and join the Islamic State. On the other side, I actually think that a clear communication strategy is also important for those being repatriated. For many individuals, they don't necessarily know what they're going to be returning to. I think we need to communicate to those being repatriated, this is the process that's going to happen. You are, going to be perhaps, arrested or held in detention, or this is the process of how you are going to be held accountable in our country. You are going to be given a fair trial. You may or may not be separated from your children. If you are, these are the processes your children will go through. These are the steps we're taking to ensure the most proactive approach. And so I think having that dual communication strategy is actually very important for encouraging people to want to be repatriated, because as of right now, it should also be emphasized, repatriation is a voluntary process. People have to want to return to their home countries. And so part of that is communicating to them what that process is going to look like so that they can buy into it as well.
Austin?
Sure, Dev put that so well. So I won't try to add too much to that other than to say I think this needs to match word to action. On the word side, as Dev mentioned, a communication strategy that recognizes the delicate, sensitive nuance of this issue is going to be required. And I would agree with Dev that what that means is leaning into an emphasis on justice and accountability for those who have been found to be responsible for the heinous crime perpetrated by the Islamic State, particularly for adults. On the flip side here, I think we need to begin from a starting point when talking about minor children as seeing them primarily or first as a baseline as victims, right? And having far less agency in this. And I think part of the strategic communication strategy in cultivating acceptance of some of these families could and should underscore the vulnerability of those minor persons and the opportunity that reintegration provides for their eventual rehabilitation and ensuring their rights, right, as human persons. On the action side, is that I think it also needs to be made clear that these persons these returned persons would not just be dropped off and left, right, in a local and home community, but that the government and its multi-sector partners would be closely involved, both in the monitoring and resourcing and support of that reintegration process. Martyn mentioned this in his preliminary comments, but part of the funding strategy, right, is also providing resources to communities to prepare them to receive the returned persons. And so what I think will be critical in navigating this really nuanced, delicate space is making sure that those words and actions are supportive of one another.
Martyn?
Yeah, thank you. Let me just build on what Austin and Dev have said. First of all, Coalition is very conscious of the relationship between, as it were, the families and who really need something other than justice, as it were. They need all sorts of other things. And those fighters who do need to be brought to justice. So, as is the government of Iraq, to be honest, so the deal by which 150 families are brought out of al-Hawl is also dependent upon the movement of 50 Iraqis out of the detention facilities, men, basically, out of the detention facilities that Dev has mentioned at the same time. And in some cases, those movements have not been able to be synchronized, so the total movements have not happened. But that is happening, and the coalition has been instrumental, and indeed hosts what is known as a fusion cell, by which the SDF, SAIJ, the coalition, and various bits of the Iraqi government and security agencies come together to manage that process, so that everybody is clear about what's happening, who's being moved, when they're being moved, and so on and so on. So that's the first point. There's a clear relationship between those two different bodies of folk. I think the second point, to pick up Austin's point about, as it were, words and deeds. I'm in the communications business, and I can spin a story for quite a while, but ultimately it does need to be backed up by substance, or it's just not a credible story. And so when you're talking about moving people back into their communities, we can prepare them, as we do, by giving them all sorts of support, psychosocial support, life skills, etc., etc. But when they get back to those communities, if there are no jobs for them, if they really add to the problem of insufficient public services, we're going to have a problem. The substance is behind the messaging. And there is a real capacity constraint here. There always is in Iraq, and we're dealing with a particularly acute problem, moving tens of thousands of people who have been through the most bizarre of circumstances back into communities that are already suffering from a dearth of capacity. So we've got to square that off in some way. But there are good news stories which can be communicated to create what we often call a sort of displacement narrative, or a more positive cycle of a narrative. Final point, I think, I would say is penultimate point is Deb's completely right. And we say consistently, putting ourselves in the shoes of residents, what is it that people are told about their circumstances? Not very much is the honest answer. So if you are a resident in al-Hawl camp and you are told that you are being moved as a result of volunteering, but you are then told that you are being moved, you're probably not told, in fact, you are not really told where you're going to. You learn when you get there, it's Jeddah, Camp Jeddah, Jeddah 1. But you don't know that that's going to happen. You're moved usually at the dead of night over a number of days. These are not comforting circumstances, and you are not informed about that process, and so on. When you're in Jeddah 1, you're not told what Jeddah 1 is. You're not told how long you're going to be there. You're not told what's going to happen to you next. So this is the journey that we think absolutely has to be, and the communicative gaps in that journey that absolutely have to be filled, and we are trying to do that. Final point really is about the imbalance between demand and supply. There is a hell of a demand, large number of people. The supply of resources, and that including that from the government of Iraq, is just not sufficient to find that balance just at the moment. But that's the daily load. That's the daily task that we have to overcome. Thanks.
Super. So there's tremendous interest here. We've got a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to try and splice them up amongst each of you. So the first come in are the following. This first one, Austin, will be for you. I'll ask the three and then we can just go through. Is there any sense of recidivism rates for repatriated ISIS families? So Austin, you mentioned the term recidivism. I'm going to lay that at your doorstep. Dev, one question asks, how are you measuring successful de-radicalization or reintegration? And specifically, how do you do that with children, maybe many years away from being ready or old enough to act out on ISIS ideology? And you had mentioned evaluations several times, so I'm going to park that with you. And Martyn, you just mentioned something that segues perfectly into the next question, which is you mentioned at one point an effort to present a more positive picture of al-Hawl. You mentioned that you can spin a yarn for some time, but ultimately there will have to be some fact behind there. Talk to us about that, because it seems like it's pretty much a not good story. How do we spin a more positive picture of al-Hawl. Dev, let's start with you and
Yeah.
then go to Austin and Martyn.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question of measuring success. So I will say that in the United States, it is very, very hard to measure or regulate what someone believes. So I usually take a step back from the idea of de-radicalization, because that is nearly impossible to measure, and focus on reintegration or disengagement. And so I think that's kind of an actual measurable factor. We can't always know what is going on in someone's head, or, even enforce what's going on in someone's head if they still hold a close tie to the ideology. But what we can measure is, are they functioning members of society? Are they not, re-offending, which I'll let Austin kind of deal with that aspect of the question. And I think the reason we call for evaluations in the way we do is that there are options where people may or may not reoffend. And it's important to know that we don't want to necessarily scrap an entire program where 99% of the people who go through a program are successfully reintegrated into society, and 1% or 1% is not. And so if we have effective evaluation tools to track these individuals' processes, what's working, what's not, we can often find out what the issue is for that 1% that isn't. And so we don't necessarily need to scrap an entire program, but rather focus on the issues that have worked and haven't, and kind of readjust going forward. And I think the questioner was correct. These are long-term programs for success. When we're talking about individuals, trauma-informed care, I highly recommend checking out the more extensive report that we did on trauma-informed care, specifically for minors. Some of these traumas and issues can pop up in adulthood, and we're dealing with minors now. So this could be a very long, process. And so when we create these programs, they do need to be sustainable. And so we call for evaluation early and often. It's not just a one-time evaluation of an individual and the trauma they're facing, but kind of maintaining those evaluations and having also multiple perspectives for evaluation, not just one, not just asking the individual what their trauma is, but, monitoring, speaking to those that are involved in the process throughout.
Great. Austin?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. I think a really important question as it relates to recidivism. This is really a question about the blowback rate, right? What happens when returnees return, and what's the likelihood that they then engage or re-engage in violent activity? I'll say two things. One is that preliminary research based off of returning combatants and ISIS-related persons to Europe suggests a relatively low blowback rate, but to balance that and to provide some temper to that assessment is that I would argue, especially in the case of the United States, that it is still too soon to tell. I think that it's important that we remain highly attentive to this risk and remain vigilant. Two aspects here suggest, as Dev suggested, the need for sustained attention. One is that persons, particularly adults who have already been tried and prosecuted and sentenced, are only just beginning and to be released, right? To be on parole, meaning they would have relative to being incarcerated, would have a greater opportunity and be in a better position to conduct an attack, where they don't have that opportunity at this current time. The second thing I think is equally important, and it ties into Dev's earlier comment, is that we don't know when some of the traumas that were experienced by minor returnees may manifest. And so as it relates to blowback rate tracking, the risk of recidivism, of engagement or re-engagement with a violent extremist ideology, will be important also for minors to make sure that they have the services and the care that they need to find those credible off-ramps from engagement or recidivism as well. And so to sort of come back around, full cap on this initial assessment is that preliminary evidence suggests a relatively low blowback rate, but that should not discount how we treat the risk of this issue moving forward.
Martyn.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just be clear on this question of a positive picture. What we're not trying to do is suggest that it's that al-Hawl camp is a rose garden. Not at all. But there is something there to work on, depending on and your messages and your content depends hugely upon your audiences. So let me break that down briefly. If your audience are members, those in the camp, there is no meaningful communicative function within the camps that tell them what is going on. I talked to certain people quite recently about the extent to which, if somebody in the camps feels that they are intimidated or being threatened, what happens? What can they do about that? And the answer was, well, there is an office over there, and they can come and see us in the office and tell us about it, and we will do something about it. I mean, the likelihood of that happening is pretty much zero. Or if those poor people do that, the risk to their lives is considerable. There are communicative ways in which that can be overcome, and that's just one example. Most residents don't know of the improvements in the facilities in the camps because there isn't a communicative function in the camps. There isn't a mechanism by which that information is being relayed to them, and so on. Are there any educational facilities in the camp that are broadcast in the way that we adapted educational facilities during COVID to get to people not in schools or children not in schools but at home? No. So there's an option there. That's in the camps. But there are improvements in the camps that we can tell people about and are beginning to do so. If you're outside the camps, if you are in Iraq, for example, you don't know anything but people in al-Hawl are monsters. And why would you have them back into your communities? There are examples where we've addressed that with UNDP and UNICEF through communicative activity, but also community-based activity. And those perceptions change radically as a consequence of that. So there are clear examples which we think we can apply to a larger flow of Iraqis out of the camps. Ditto in Syria, where we're having similar successes. Pockets of success, but every time a pocket adds to another pocket. So we're encouraged by that. Third, internationally. On the whole, the perception of al-Hawl and its residents is a very negative one. It's a ticking time bomb. They are also monsters. I think Charles did us a great service recently by describing the camps as, I think, 13 Guantanamos in northeast Syria was the title of his particular piece. It's all very justified. And for a while, that sort of international coverage, pretty bold, pretty negative, has helped to generate more interest in the international community in solving a problem that really does need to be solved. We are very strongly of the view that that moment is over. We should stop talking about how bad al-Hawl is, because actually that's some of the best Daesh propaganda you can generate, because Daesh tells the world that the West is basically incarcerating all of these innocent folk in these camps, just like we did in other detention facilities over time. So let us stop talking about that and paint a more positive picture about the numbers, for example, about some of the reality, not all of the reality, but some of the reality on the ground, which is not all negative. And over time, we work on a sort of displacement theory. You can begin to display bad news with more positive news. Thanks.
Super. I'm going to continue with this and try and get in as many questions as possible. One that came in specifically for you, Austin. Do you believe there is a, quote, shared understanding of success, end quote, between key countries? And if not, how do you propose creating that? Dev, a question that came in for you. How do you hold women accountable that may have been trafficked into Daesh-controlled territory? And are there any countries that are handling this issue particularly well? And Martyn, as the head of the anti-Daesh strategic communication cells, what are some of the challenges you see in trying to gain consensus in the international community, which I guess is trying to ask you, tell us about the herding of cats. And just to lump in one second question there, are there any partners within the UK, within the US, agencies or partners, other countries or international organizations who, if they were more engaged, would bring particularly big added value. So Austin, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, again, really great question. I'll be quick. I think there is at the top level generally a shared sense of what successful reintegration means with respect to having a shared or a sense of inclusiveness, belonging in the community, and on the other side that there's this reduced risk of engagement or recidivism. You look at some of the work that our colleagues and friends over at ICCT have done in partnership with the European Union, for example, you see a lot of similar language expressed around those top level objectives and defining what success means and to incorporate and to include some of our key partners in this work. Where I think there may be continued room for identification of sort of a shared mental model is in common evaluation metrics, how we measure success, the specific instruments that are used. I think this can facilitate in a really productive way information sharing and continued collaboration on best practices as we move forward through the repatriation and more fully into the reintegration and rehabilitation process. And so the opportunity for continuing to distill and share this sort of common mental model of success, that opportunity is still there. At the top line with respect to what success with reintegration means, I think we're fortunate that shared sense is very much in place.
Yep.
Thank you. So on the question of trafficked, I think there's two things I wanted to disaggregate. Minors who were trafficked, some by third parties, some by their own parents who were brought to the Islamic State, and adult individuals. The majority of adult women who traveled from third countries were not trafficked. These were individuals who made a decision to go on their own, bring their families, sometimes their children, and join the Islamic State. There is a very small percentage of women, adult women, who were trafficked, but that is the minority, not the majority. That's not to say that once individuals got to the Islamic State, they then changed their mind and wanted to leave and could not leave the Islamic State territory. But those are very different things. When we look at programs specifically looking at accountability and reintegration for women, they're very, very different across different countries. The United States, North America, Europe has taken a prosecutorial approach for adult women, the majority of adult women. There are also countries in the Western Balkans that are focusing solely, and Central Asia that are focusing solely on reintegration. So part of that is removing the prosecutorial approach. Kosovo has prosecuted, but has waived and given clemency to all those that were prosecuted or waived their sentences. Some countries have granted clemency to women. I struggle with this, and there's not enough evaluation yet. I think one of the things that Austin addressed is that we're not far enough into this process. I think one thing I personally struggle with is that when we look at success for how reintegration really is, it has to come with a level of accountability. And so if we say that women are, because they are women, therefore not accountable for their own actions, I do worry that there is going to be a step down the line where there is a reintegration issue for this. But many countries have decided to focus solely on reintegration, and only time will tell and evaluations will tell looking at success. Thank you.
Martyn?
Building some consensus. Well, it's really not straightforward. You would imagine that it would be, because it's such an obviously difficult problem or urgent problem to solve. But the reality is that that's not the case. And let's just sort of pick out some examples. And I'm not being critical. I am in some cases being critical, but in most cases not. I'm just really being descriptive. I'll just get the critical bit out of the way first. We're in Syria. We're talking about Syria. I mean, Syria is run by a monster. We can't have any dealings with that monster, but other members of the international community feel that we do. When it comes down to it, the majority of Syrians in al-Hawl camp are from regime territory. What do we do about that? It's going to be very difficult to build a consensus with the Assad regime on a long-term future for those 15,000, I think it is about 15,000 people. That's a really complicated one. And of course, there are members of the coalition who do not accept at all that we should be dealing with the SDF. I think we know what we mean by that. Moving on to another host government, as it were, we're also dealing in Iraq. Now, the government of Iraq is a complicated affair. It's not one cat that is following the line of others. There are all sorts of interests vested and so on. And it does have problems of corruption and governance, ability, capacity, and so on and so on. These are not just solved overnight because there are 25,000 Iraqis who do need to be repatriated, not least because there are many, many more Iraqis in other camps in Syria who could also be, also known as IDPs, who could be repatriated. And plenty of my humanitarian colleagues say, it's all very well, you talking about how to deal with the al-Hawl problems, but what about all of those others who are in no way responsible for their circumstances? What is happening to support them? So problems in the region. Are there institutions in the UK and the US that are problematic who could be more on board? I don't really feel that that's the case. I would have said that about a year ago, it was really difficult to get humanitarian actors and military actors to talk to each other. That's so not the case now. And that's a really positive development because we all have a contribution to make to solve these problems. The penultimate point is communications can do an awful lot. And we found ourselves in a rather embarrassing position in Amman where, because we outlined what communications could do, everybody sort of jumped on that vehicle and said, well, communications is basically the answer to everything. Well, it's not. It can be part of the solution. So there's something about people committing to do their bit. And then the final point is, that's all very well, but we're talking about resource. This is the bottom line. We need an awful lot of resource to resolve most of these issues. And it is a time when the need to counter terrorism is lower down the list of priorities for most governments, including the United States government and the United Kingdom's government. CT is not what it was, thankfully. Problem is, terrorism is still a problem. We're not particularly good at finishing the job. And this, I think, is an example of that. And we've run out of the money to do that. And at the same time, over the last few years, goodness me, we've had COVID, rubbished our economies so that there's less money available to spend. Afghanistan, say no more. Ukraine, Putin has invaded Ukraine, and the principal threat that we are all facing is from that. And a huge amount of resource from the British government's development source funds have been diverted correctly into solving all of the problems that Putin has generated. I'm not on some sort of soapbox here, but it is just the case that a huge percentage of Britain's development budget, which would be going into Syria, is now going into responding to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Now, these are things that you can't just magic away, I'm afraid. Not sure what the answer is. Wouldn't be running for being the Prime Minister even if I did know the answers. We just have to work our way at this issue. Thanks.
Martyn, I am here for you on the soapbox. This is good content. It is a sign of a very successful event with people that other people want to hear from, experts, that there are so many questions we didn't get to. I apologize if I didn't get to your question, including kind of at levels of analysis, the big picture, including, Martyn, your comment about how do we pursue this? Is it sustainable at a time when counterterrorism is no longer the top issue? Issues about how we get countries to do it at all, to repatriate and address judicial reform and other things, and then how to make it work. For example, Deb, we didn't get to a conversation about trauma-informed care, which I know is something you care about a lot. At the end of the day, Martyn's right. Counterterrorism is no longer the top thing. It's also the case that this particular issue set mishandled or not handled well, is the single biggest guarantor that counterterrorism will continue to be a very, very prominent threat internationally, separate from the domestic issues we're all facing. Please join me, everyone, in thanking these three fantastic speakers. I want to remind you again about this fantastic piece of research that Insight published that Austin and Devorah and others were involved in. If you didn't get enough of this, and based on the questions you did not, this is a good place to start. Thank you all very, very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Martyn, Austin, Devorah, thank you all very, very much.